gray and then almost white. The overhanging banks of clouds seemed to withdraw a little from the steaming earth. Haze that hung always among the mushroom forests and above the fungus hills grew more tenuous, and the slow, misty rain that dripped the whole night long ceased reluctantly. As far as the eye could see, a mad whirl stretched out, a world of insensate cruelties and strange, fierce maternal solicitudes. The insects of the night, the great moths whose wings spread far and wide in the dimness, and the huge fireflies 4 feet in length, whose beacons made the earth glow in their pale, weird light, the insects of the night had sought their hiding places. Now the creatures of the day ventured forth. A great ant-hill towered 100 feet in the air. Upon its gravel and boulder-strewn side a commotion became visible. The earth crumbled and fell into an invisible opening. Then a dark chasm appeared, and 2 slender thread-like antennae peered out. A warrior ant emerged and stood for an instant in the daylight, looking all about for signs of danger to the ant city. He was all of 10 inches long, this ant, and his mandibles were fierce and strong. A second and third warrior came from the inside of the ant-hill and ran with tiny clickings about the hillock, waving their antennae restlessly, ever searching for a menace to their city. They returned to the gateway from which they had made their appearance, evidently bearing reassuring messages, because shortly after they had re-entered the gateway of the ant city, a flood of black, ill-smelling workers poured out of the opening and dispersed upon their business. The clicking of their limbs and an occasional whining stridulation made an incessant sound as they scattered over the earth, foraging among the mushrooms and giant cabbages, among the rubbish heaps of the gigantic beehives and wasp colonies, and among the remains of the tragedies of the night for food for their city. The city of the ants had begun its daily toil in which everyone shared without supervision or coercion. Deep in the recesses of the pyramid galleries were hollowed out and winding passages that led down a fathomless distance into the earth below. Somewhere in the maze of tunnels there was a royal apartment in which the queen ant reposed, waited upon by assiduous courtiers, fed by royal stewards, and combed and rubbed by the hands of her subjects and children. But even the huge monarch of the city had her constant and pressing duty of maternity. A dozen times the size of her largest loyal servant, she was no less bound by the unwritten but imperative laws of the city than they. From the time of waking to the time of rest, she was ordained to be the Queen Mother in the strictest and most literal sense of the word, for at intervals, to be measured only in terms of minutes, she brought forth a single egg, perhaps 3 inches in length, which was instantly seized by one of her eager attendants and carried in haste to the municipal nursery. There it was placed in a tiny cell a foot or more in length, until a sack-shaped grub appeared, all soft white body, save for a tiny mouth. Then the nurses took it in charge and fed it with curious, tender gestures, until it had waxed large and fat, and slept the sleep of metamorphosis. When it emerged from its rudimentary cocoon, it took the places of its nurses until its soft skin had hardened into the horny armor of the workers and soldiers, and then it joined the throng of workers that poured out of the city at dawn to forage for food, to bring back its finds, and to share with the warriors and the nurses, the drone males and the young queens, and all the other members of its community, their duties in the city itself. This was the life of the social insect: absolute devotion to the cause of its city, utter abnegation of self-interest for the sake of its fellows, and death at their hands when their usefulness was past. They neither knew nor expected more or less. It is a strange instinct that prompts these creatures to devote their lives to their city, taking no smallest thought for their individual good, without even the call of maternity or sex to guide them. Only the queen knows motherhood. The others know nothing but toil for purposes they do not understand, and to an end which they cannot dream. At intervals all over the world of Burl's time, these ant cities rose above the surrounding ground, some small and barely begun, and others ancient colonies which were truly the continuation of cities first built when the ants were insects to be crushed beneath the feet of men. These ancient strongholds towered 200, 300, or even 400 feet above the plains, and their inhabitants would have had to be numbered in millions, if not billions. Not all the earth was subject to the ants, however. Bees and wasps and more deadly creatures crawled over and flew over its surface. The bees were 4 feet and more in length, and slender-waisted wasps darted here and there, preying upon the colossal crickets that sang deep bass music to their mates. And the length of the crickets was the length of a man and more. Spiders with bloated bellies waited, motionless, in their snares, whose threads were the size of small cables, waiting for some luckless giant insect to be entangled in the gummy traps. And butterflies fluttered over the festering plains of this new world, tremendous creatures whose wings could only be measured in terms of yards. An outcropping of rock jutted up abruptly from a fungus-covered plain. Shelf fungi and strangely colored moles stained the stone until the shining quartz was hidden almost completely from view, but the whole glistened like tinted crystal from the dank wetness of the night. Little wisps of vapor curled away from the slopes as the moisture was taken up by the already moisture-laden air. Seen from a distance, the outcropping of rock looked innocent and still, but a nearer view showed many things. Here a hunting wasp had come upon a gray worm, and was methodically inserting its sting into each of the 12 segments of the faintly writhing creature. Presently the worm would be completely paralyzed, and would be carried to the burrow of the wasp, where an egg would be laid upon it, from which a tiny maggot would presently hatch. Then weeks of agony for the great gray worm, conscious but unable to move, while the maggot fed upon its living flesh. There the tiny spider, youngest of the hatchlings, barely 4 inches across, stealthily stalked some other still tinier mite, the little many-legged larva of the oil beetle known as the bee louse. The almost infinitely small bee louse was barely 2 inches long, and could easily hide in the thick fur of a great bumblebee. This one small creature would never fulfill its destiny, however. The hatchling spider sprang. It was a combat of midgets which was soon over. When the spider had grown and was feared as a huge black-bellied tarantula, it would slay monster crickets with the same ease and the same implacable ferocity. The outcropping of rock looked still and innocent. There was one point where it overhung, forming a shelf, beneath which the stone fell away in a sheer drop. Many-colored fungus growths covered the rock, making it a riot of tints and shades. But hanging from the roof-like projection of the stone there was a strange drab-white object. It was in the shape of half a globe, perhaps 6 feet by 6 feet at its largest. A number of little semicircular doors were fixed about its sides like inverted arches, each closed by a blank wall. One of them would open, but only one. The house was like the half of a pallid orange fastened to the roof of rock. Thick cables stretched in every direction for yards upon yards, anchoring the habitation firmly. But the most striking of the things about the house, still and quiet and innocent, like all the rest of the rock outcropping, were the ghastly trophies fastened to the outer walls and hanging from long silken chains below. Here was the hind leg of one of the smaller beetles. There was the wing case of a flying creature. Here a snail shell, 2 feet in diameter, hanging at the end of an inch-thick cable. There a boulder that must have weighed 30 or 40 pounds, dangling in similar fashion. But fashioned here and there, haphazard and irregularly, were other, more repulsive remnants. The shrunken head armor of a beetle, the fierce jaws of a cricket, the pitiful shreds of 100 creatures that had formed forgotten meals for the bloated insect within the home. Comparatively small as was the nest of the Clotho spider, it was decorated as no ogre's castle had ever been adorned. Legs sucked dry of their contents, corselets of horny armor forever to be unused by any creature, a wing of this insect, the head of that, and dangling by the longest cord of all, with a silken cable wrapped carefully about it to keep the parts together, was the shrunken, shriveled, dried-up body of a long-dead man. Outside the nest was a place of gruesome relics. Within, it was a place of luxury and ease. A cushion of softest down filled all the bulging bottom of the hemisphere. A canopy of similarly luxurious texture interposed itself between the rocky roof and the dark, hideous body of the resting spider. The eyes of the hairy creature glittered like diamonds, even in the darkness, but the loathsome attenuated legs were tucked under the round-bellied body, and the spider was at rest. It had fed. It waited, motionless, without desires or aversions, without emotions or perplexities, in comfortable, placid, machine-like contentment, until time should bring the call to feed again. A fresh carcass had been added to the decorations of the nest only the night before. For many days the spider would repose in motionless splendor within the silken castle. When hunger came again, a nocturnal foray, a creature would be pounced upon and slain, brought bodily to the nest and feasted upon, its body festooned upon the exterior, and another half-sleeping, half-waking period of dreamful idleness within the sybaritic charnel house would ensue. Slowly and timidly, half a dozen pink-skinned creatures made their way through the mushroom forest that led to the outcropping of rock under which the Clotho spider's nest was slung. They were men, degraded remnants of the once dominant race. Burl was their leader, and was distinguished solely by 2 3-foot stumps of the feathery golden antennae of a night-flying moth he had bound to his forehead. In his hand was a horny, chitinous spear, taken from the body of an unknown flying creature killed by the flames of the burning purple hills. Since Burl's return from his solitary and involuntary journey, he had been greatly revered by his tribe. Hitherto it had been but a leaderless, formless group of people, creeping to the same hiding place at nightfall to share in the food of the fortunate, and shudder at the fate of those who might not appear. Now Burl had walked boldly to them, bearing upon his back the gray bulk of a labyrinth spider he had slain with his own hands, and clad in wonderful garments of a gorgeousness they envied and admired. They hung upon his words as he struggled to tell them of his adventures, and slowly and dimly they began to look to him for leadership. He was wonderful. For days they had listened breathlessly to the tale of his adventures, but when he demanded that they follow him in another and more perilous affair, they were appalled. A peculiar strength of will had come to Burl. He had seen and done things that no man in the memory of his tribe had seen or done. He had stood by when the purple hills burned, and formed a funeral pyre for the hordes of army ants, and for uncounted thousands of flying creatures. He had caught a leaping tarantula upon the point of his spear, and had escaped from the web of a banded web spider by oiling his body so that the sticky threads of the snare refused to hold him fast. He had attacked and killed a great gray labyrinth spider. But most potent of all, he had returned and had been welcomed by Saya. Saya of the swift feet and slender limbs, whose smile roused strange emotions in Burl's breast. It was the adoring gaze of Saya that had roused Burl to this last pitch of rashness. Months before, the Clotho spider in the hemispherical silk castle of the gruesome decorations had killed and eaten one of the men of the tribe. Burl and the spider's victim had been together when the spider appeared, and the first faint gray light of morning barely silhouetted the shaggy, horrible creature as it leaped from the ambush behind a toadstool toward the fear-stricken pair. Its attenuated legs were outstretched, its mandibles gaped wide, its jaws clashed horribly as it formed a black blotch in mid-air against the lightening sky. Burl had fled, screaming, when the other man was seized. Now, however, he was leading half a dozen trembling men toward the inverted dome in which the spider dozed. 2 or 3 of them bore spears like Burl himself, but they bore them awkwardly and timorously. Burl himself was possessed of a strange, fictitious courage. It was the utter recklessness of youth, coupled with the eternal masculine desire to display prowess before a desired female. The wavering advance came to a halt. Most of the naked men stopped from fear, but Burl stopped to invoke his newly discovered inner self that had furnished him with such marvelous plans. Quite accidentally, he had found that if he persistently asked himself a question, some sort of answer came from within. Now he gazed up from a safe distance and asked himself how he and the others were to slay the Clotho spider. The nest was some 40 feet from the ground, on the underside of a shelf of rock. There was sheer open space beneath it, but it was firmly held to its support by long silken cables that curled to the upper side of the rock shelf, clinging to the stone. Burl gazed, and presently an idea came to him. He beckoned to the others to follow him, and they did so, their knees knocking together from their fright. At the slightest alarm they would flee, screaming in fear, but Burl did not plan that there should be any alarm. He led them to the rear of the singular rock formation, up the gently sloping side and toward the precipitous edge. He drew near the point where the rock fell away. A long tentacle-like silk cable curled up over the edge of a little promontory of stone that jutted out into nothingness. Burl began to feel oddly cold, and something of the panic of the other men communicated itself to him. This was one of the anchoring cables that held the spider's castle secure. He looked and found others, 6 or 7 in all, which performed the task of keeping the shaggy, horrid ogre's home from falling to the ground below. His idea did not desert him, however, and he drew back to whisper orders to his followers. They obeyed him solely because they were afraid, and he spoke in an authoritative tone, but they did obey, and brought a dozen heavy boulders of perhaps 40 pounds weight each. Burl grasped one of the silken cables at its end, and tore it loose from the rock for a space of perhaps 2 yards. His flesh crawled as he did so, but something within him drove him on. Then, while beads of perspiration stood out on his forehead, induced by nothing less than cold physical fear, he tied the boulder to the cable. The first one done, he felt emboldened, and made a second fast, and a third. One of his men stood near the edge of the rock, listening in agonized apprehension. Burl had soon tied a heavy stone to each of the cables he saw, and as a matter of fact, there was but one of them he failed to notice. That one had been covered by the flaking mold that took the place of grass upon the rocky eminence. There were left upon the promontory several of the boulders for which there was no use, but Burl did not attempt to double the weights on the cables. He took his followers aside and explained his plan in whispers. Quaking, they agreed, and trembling, they prepared to carry it out. One of them stationed himself beside each of the boulders, Burl at the largest. He gave a signal, and half a dozen ripping, tearing sounds broke the sullen silence of the day. The boulders clashed and clattered down the rocky side of the precipice, tearing, perhaps peeling, the cables from their adhesion to the stone. They shot into open space, and jerked violently at the half-globular nest, which was wrenched from its place by the combined impetus of the 6 heavy weights. Burl had flung himself upon his face to watch what he was sure would be the death of the spider as it fell 40 feet and more, imprisoned in its heavily weighted home. His eyes sparkled with triumph as he saw the ghastly, trophy-laden house swing out from the cliff. Then he gasped in terror. One of the cables had not been discovered. That single cable held the spider's castle from a fall, though the nest had been torn from its anchorage, and now dangled heavily on its side in mid-air. A convulsive struggle seemed to be going on within. Then one of the arch-like doors opened, and the spider emerged, evidently in terror and confused by the light of day, but still venomous and still deadly. It found but a single of its anchoring cables intact, that leading to the cliff top hard by Burl's head. The spider sprang for this single cable. Its legs grasped the slender thread eagerly, while it began to climb rapidly up toward the cliff top. As with all the creatures of Burl's time, its first thought was of battle, not flight, and it came up the thin cord with its poison fangs unsheathed and its mandibles clashing in rage. The shaggy hair upon its body seemed to bristle with insane ferocity, and the horrible thin legs moved with desperate haste as it hastened to meet and wreak vengeance upon the cause of its sudden alarm. Burl's followers fled, uttering shrieks of fear, and Burl started to his feet in the grip of a terrible panic. Then his hands struck one of the heavy boulders. Exerting every ounce of his strength, he pushed it over the cliff just where the cable appeared above the edge. For the fraction of a second there was silence, and then the indescribable sound of an impact against a soft body. There was a gasping cry, and a moment later the curiously muffled clatter of the boulder striking the earth below. Somehow the sound suggested that the boulder had struck first upon some soft object. A faint cry came from the bottom of the hill. The last of Burl's men was leaping to a hiding place among the mushrooms of the forest, and had seen the sheen of shining armor just before him. He cried out and waited for death, but only a delicately formed wasp rose heavily into the air, bearing beneath it the more and more feebly struggling body of a giant cricket. Burl had stood paralyzed, deprived of the power of movement after casting the boulder over the cliff. That one action had taken the last ounce of his initiative, and if the spider had hauled itself over the rocky edge and darted toward him, slavering its thick spittle and uttering sounds of mad fury, Burl would not even have screamed as it seized him. He was like a dead thing. But the oddly muffled sound of the boulder striking the ground below brought back hope of life and power of movement. He peered over the cliff. The nest still dangled at the end of the single cable, still freighted with its gruesome trophies, but on the ground below a crushed and horribly writhing form was moving in convulsions of rage and agony. Long hairy legs worked desperately from a body that was no more than a mass of pulped flesh. A ferocious jaw tried to clamp upon something, and there was no other jaw to meet it. An evil-smelling, sticky liquid exuded from the mangled, writhing thing upon the earth, moving in terrible contortions of torment. Presently an ant drew near and extended inquisitive antennae at the helpless monster wounded to death. A shrill stridulation sounded out, and 3 or 4 other foot-long ants hastened up to wait patiently just outside the spider's reach until its struggles should have lessened enough to make possible the salvage of flesh from the perhaps still living creature for the ant city a mile away. And Burl, up on the cliff top, danced and gesticulated in triumph. He had killed the Clotho spider, which had slain one of the tribesmen 4 months before. Glory was his. All the tribesmen had seen the spider living. Now he would show them the spider dead. He stopped his dance of triumph and walked down the hill in haughty grandeur. He would reproach his timid followers for fleeing from the spider, leaving him to kill it alone. Quite naively, Burl assumed that it was his place to give orders, and that of the others to obey. True, no one had attempted to give orders before, or to enforce their execution, but Burl had reached the eminently wholesome conclusion that he was a wonderful person, whose wishes should be respected. Burl, filled with fresh notions of his own importance, strutted on toward the hiding place of the tribe, growing more and more angry with the other men for having deserted him. He would reproach them, would probably beat them. They would be afraid to protest, and in the future would undoubtedly be afraid to run away. Burl was quite convinced that running away was something he could not tolerate in his followers. Obscurely and conveniently in the extreme back of his mind, he reasoned that not only did a larger number of men present at a scene of peril increase the chances of coping with the danger, but they also increased the chances that the victim selected by the dangerous creature would be another than himself. Burl's reasoning was unsophisticated but sound, perhaps unconscious but nonetheless effective. He grew quite furious with the deserters. They had run away. They had fled from a mere spider. A shrill whine filled the air, and a 10-inch ant dashed at Burl with its mandibles extended threateningly. Burl's path had promised to interrupt the salvaging work of the insect, engaged in scraping shreds of flesh from the corselet of one of the smaller beetles slain the previous night. The ant dashed at Burl like an infuriated fox terrier, and Burl scurried away in undignified retreat. The ant might not be dangerous, but bites from its formic acid-poisoned mandibles were no trifles. Burl came to the tangled thicket of mushrooms in which his tribe folk hid. The entrance was tortuous and difficult to penetrate, and could be blocked on occasion with stones and toadstool pulp. Burl made his way toward the central clearing, and heard, as he went, the sound of weeping, and the excited chatter of the tribespeople. Those who had fled from the rocky cliff had returned with the news that Burl was dead, and Saya lay weeping beneath an overshadowing toadstool. She was not yet the mate of Burl, but the time would come when all the tribe would recognize a status dimly different from the usual tribal relationship. Burl stepped into the clearing, and straightway cuffed the first man he came upon, then the next and the next. There was a cry of astonishment, and the next second instinctive fearful glances at that entrance to the hiding place. Had Burl fled from the spider, and was it following? Burl spoke loftily, saying that the spider was dead, that its legs, each one the length of a man, were still, and its fierce jaws and deadly poison fangs harmless forevermore. 10 minutes later, he was leading an incredulous, awed little group of pink-skinned people to the spot below the cliff where the spider actually lay dead, with the ants busily at work upon its remains. And when he went back to the hiding place, he donned again his great cloak that was made from the wing of a magnificent moth, slain by the flames of the purple hills, and he sat down in splendor upon a crumbling toadstool, to feast upon the glances of admiration and awe that were sent toward him. Only Saya held back shyly until he motioned for her to draw near, when she seated herself at his feet and gazed up at him with unutterable adoration in her eyes. But while Burl basked in the radiance of the tribe's admiration, danger was drawing near them all. For many months there had been strange red mushrooms growing slowly here and there all over the earth, they knew. The tribesfolk had speculated about them, but forebode tasting them because they were strange, and strange things were usually dangerous and often fatal. Now those red growths had ripened and grown ready to emit their spores. Their rounded tops had grown fat, and the tough skin grew taut, as if a strange pressure were being applied from within. And today, while Burl luxuriated in his position of feared and admired great man of his tribe, at a spot a long distance away upon a hilltop, one of the red mushrooms burst. The spores inside the taut, tough skin shot all about as if scattered by an explosion, and made a little cloud of reddish, impalpable dust, which hung in the air and moved slowly with the sluggish breeze. A bee droned into the thin red cloud of dust, lazily and heavily flying back toward the hive, but barely had she entered the tinted atmosphere when her movements became awkward and convulsive, effortful and excited. She trembled and twisted in mid-air in a peculiar fashion, then dropped to the earth, while her abdomen moved violently. Bees, like almost all insects, breathe through spiracles on the undersides of their abdomens. This bee had breathed in some of the red mushroom's spores. She thrashed about desperately upon the toadstools on which she had fallen, struggling for breath, for life. After a long time, she was still. The cloud of red mushroom spores had strangled or poisoned her, and everywhere the red fringe grew, such explosions were taking place, one by one, and wherever the red cloud hung in the air, creatures were breathing them in and dying in convulsions of strangulation. Chapter 2. The Journey. Darkness. The soft blanketing night of the age of fungoids had fallen over all the earth, and there was blackness everywhere that was not good to have. Here and there, however, dim bluish lights glowed near the ground. There an intermittent glow showed that a firefly had wandered far from the rivers and swamps above which most of his kind now congregated. Now a faintly luminous ball of fire drifted above the steaming, moisture-sodden earth. It was a will-o'-the-wisp grown to a yard in diameter. From the low-hanging banks of clouds that hung perpetually overhead, large warm raindrops fell ceaselessly. A drop, a pause, and then another drop, added to the already dank moisture of the ground below. The world of fungus growths flourished on just such dampness and humidity. It seemed as if the toadstools and mushrooms could be heard, swelling and growing large in the darkness. Rustlings and stealthy movements sounded furtively through the night, and from above the heavy throb of mighty night wings was continuous. The tribe was hidden in the midst of a tangled copse of toadstools too thickly interwoven for the larger insects to penetrate. Only the little midgets hid in its recesses during the night time, and the smaller moths during the day. About and among the bases of the toadstools, however, where their spongy stalks rose from the humid earth, small beetles roamed, singing cheerfully to themselves in deep bass notes. They were small and round, some 6 or 8 inches long, and their bellies were pale gray. And as they went about they emitted sounds which would have been chirps had they been other than low as the lowest tone of a harp. They were truffle beetles, in search of the dainty tidbits on which epicures once had feasted. Some strange sense seemed to tell them when one of half a dozen varieties of truffle was beneath them, and they paused in their wandering to dig a tunnel straight down. A foot, 2 feet, or 2 yards, all was the same to them. In time they would come upon the morsel they sought, and would remain at the bottom of their temporary home until it was consumed. Then another period of wandering, singing their cheerful song, until another likely spot was reached, and another tunnel begun. In a tiny open space in the center of the toadstool thicket, the tribe folk slept, with the deep notes of the truffle beetles in their ears. A new danger had come to them, but they had passed it on to Burl with a new and childlike confidence, and considered the matter settled. They slept, while beneath a glowing mushroom at one side of the clearing, Burl struggled with his new problem. He squatted upon the ground in the dim radiance of the shining toadstool, his moth-wing cloak wrapped about him, his spear in his hand, and his twin golden plumes of the moth's antennae bound to his forehead, but his face was downcast as a child's. The red mushrooms had begun to burst. Only that day one of the women seeking edible fungus for the tribal larder had seen the fat, distended globule of the red mushroom. Its skin was stretched taut and glistened in the light. The woman paid little or no attention to the red growth. Her ears were attuned to catch sounds that would warn her of danger, while her eyes searched for tidbits that would make a meal for the tribe, and more particularly for her small son left behind at the hiding-place. A ripping noise made her start up, alert on the instant. The red envelope of the mushroom had split across the top, and a thick cloud of brownish-red dust was spurting in every direction. It formed a pyramidal cloud some 30 feet in height, which enlarged and grew thinner with minor eddies within itself. A little yellow butterfly with wings barely a yard from tip to tip flapped lazily above the mushroom-covered plain. Its wings beat the air with strokes that seemed like playful taps upon a friendly element. The butterfly was literally intoxicated with the sheer joy of living. It had emerged from its cocoon barely 2 hours before, and was making its maiden flight above the strange and wonderful world. It fluttered carelessly into the red-brown cloud of mushroom spores. The woman was watching the slowly changing form of the spore mist. She saw the butterfly enter the brownish dust, and then her eyes became greedy. There was something the matter with the butterfly. Its wings no longer moved lazily and gently. They struck out in frenzied, hysterical blows that were erratic and wild. The little yellow creature no longer floated lightly and easily, but dashed here and there, wildly and without purpose, seeming to be in its death throes. It crashed helplessly against the ground and lay there moving feebly. The woman hurried forward. The wings would be new fabric with which to adorn herself, and the fragile legs of the butterfly contained choice meat. She entered the dust cloud. A stream of intolerable fire, though the woman had never seen or known of fire, burned her nostrils and seared her lungs. She gasped in pain, and the agony was redoubled. Her eyes smarted as if burning from their sockets, and tears blinded her. The woman instinctively turned about to flee, but before she had gone a dozen yards, blinded as she was, she stumbled and fell to the ground. She lay there gasping and uttering moans of pain, until one of the men of the tribe who had been engaged in foraging nearby saw her and tried to find out what had injured her. She could not speak, and he was about to leave her and tell the other tribe folk about her when he heard the clicking of an ant's limbs, and rather than have the ant pick her to pieces bit by bit and leave his curiosity ungratified, the man put her across his shoulders and bore her back to the hiding place of the tribe. It was the tale the woman had told when she partly recovered that caused Burl to sit alone all that night beneath the shining toadstool in the little clearing, puzzling his just awakened brain to know what to do. The year before there had been no red mushrooms. They had appeared only recently, but Burl dimly remembered that one day, a long time before, there had been a strange breeze which blew for 3 days and nights, and that during the time of its blowing all the tribe had been sick and had wept continually. Burl had not yet reached the point of mental development when he could associate that breeze with a storm at a distance, or reason that the spores of the red mushrooms had been borne upon the wind to the present resting places of the deadly fungus growths. Still less could he decide that the breeze had not been deadly only because it was lightly laden with the fatal dust. He knew simply that unknown red mushrooms had appeared, that they were everywhere about, and that they would burst, and that to breathe the red dust they gave out was grievous sickness or death. The tribe slept while the bravely attired figure of Burl squatted under the glowing disk of the luminous mushroom, his face a picture of querulous perplexity, and his heart full of sadness. He had consulted his strange inner self, and no plan had come to him. He knew the red mushrooms were all about. They would fill the air with their poison. He struggled with his problem while his people slumbered, and the woman who had breathed the mushroom dust sobbed softly in her troubled sleep. Presently a figure stirred on the farther side of the clearing. Saya woke and raised her head. She saw Burl crouching by the shining toadstool, his gay attire draggled and unnoticed. She watched him for a little, and the desolation of his pose awoke her pity. She rose and went to his side, taking his hand between her two, while she spoke his name softly. When he turned and looked at her, confusion smote her, but the misery in his face brought confidence again. Burl's sorrow was inarticulate. He could not explain this new responsibility for his people that had come to him, but he was comforted by her presence, and she sat down beside him. After a long time she slept, with her head resting against his side, but he continued to question himself, continued to demand an escape for his people from the suffering and danger he saw ahead. With the day an answer came. When Burl had been carried down the river on his fungus raft, and had landed in the country of the army ants, he had seen great forests of edible mushrooms, and had said to himself that he would bring Saya to that place. He remembered now that the red mushrooms were there also, but the idea of a journey remained. The hunting ground of his tribe had been free of the red fungoids until recently. If he traveled far enough, he would come to a place where there were still no red toadstools. Then came the decision. He would lead his tribe to a far country. He spoke with stern authority when the tribesmen woke, talking in few words and in a loud voice, holding up his spear as he gave his orders. The timid, pink-skinned people obeyed him meekly. They had seen the body of the Clotho spider he had slain, and he had thrown down before them the gray bulk of the labyrinth spider he had thrust through with his spear. Now he was to take them through unknown dangers to an unknown haven, but they feared to displease him. They made light loads of their mushrooms and such meat-stuffs as they had, and parceled out what little fabric they still possessed. 3 men bore spears, in addition to Burl's long shaft, and he had persuaded the other 3 to carry clubs, showing them how the weapon should be wielded. The indefinitely brighter spot in the cloud banks above, that meant the shining sun, had barely gone a quarter of the way across the sky when the trembling band of timid creatures made their way from their hiding place and set out upon their journey. For their course, Burl depended entirely upon chance. He avoided the direction of the river, however, and the path along which he had returned to his people. He knew the red mushrooms grew there. Purely by accident, he set his march toward the west, and walked cautiously on, his tribesfolk following him fearfully. Burl walked ahead, his spear held ready. He made a figure at once brave and pathetic, venturing forth in a world of monstrous ferocity and incredible malignance, armed only with a horny spear borrowed from a dead insect. His velvety cloak, made from a moth's wing, hung about his figure in graceful folds, however, and twin golden plumes nodded jauntily from his forehead. Behind him the nearly naked people followed reluctantly. Here a woman with a baby in her arms, there children of 9 or 10, unable to resist the instinct to play even in the presence of the manifold dangers of the march. They ate hungrily of the lumps of mushroom they had been ordered to carry. Then a long-legged boy, his eyes roving anxiously about in search of danger, followed. 30,000 years of flight from every peril had deeply submerged the combative nature of humanity. After the boy came 2 men, one with a short spear, and the other with a club, each with a huge mass of edible mushroom under his free arm, and both badly frightened at the idea of fleeing from dangers they knew and feared to dangers they did not know, and consequently feared much more. So was the caravan spread out. It made its way across the country with many deviations from a fixed line, and with many halts and pauses. Once a shrill stridulation filled all the air before them, a monster sound compounded of innumerable clickings and high-pitched cries. They came to the tip of an eminence and saw a great space of ground covered with tiny black bodies locked in combat. For quite half a mile in either direction, the earth was black with ants, snapping and biting at each other, locked in vice-like embraces. Each combatant couple trampled under the feet of the contending armies, with no thought of surrender or quarter. The sound of the clashing of fierce jaws upon horny armor, the cries of the maimed, and strange sounds made by the dying, and above all, the whining battle-cry of each of the fighting hordes, made a sustained uproar that was almost deafening. From either side of the battleground a pathway led back to separate ant cities, a pathway marked by the hurrying groups of reinforcements rushing to the fight. Tiny as the ants were, for once no lumbering beetles swaggered insolently in their path, nor did the hunting spiders mark them out for prey. Only little creatures smaller than the combatants themselves made use of the insect war for purposes of their own. These were little gray ants barely more than 4 inches long, who scurried about in and among the fighting creatures with marvelous dexterity, carrying off piecemeal the bodies of the dead and slaying the wounded for the same fate. They hung about the edges of the battle and invaded the abandoned areas when the tide of battle shifted, insect guerrillas, fighting for their own hands, careless of the origin of the quarrel, espousing no cause, simply salvaging the dead and living debris of the combat. Burl and his little group of followers had to make a wide detour to avoid the battle itself, and the passage between bodies of reinforcements hurrying to the scene of strife was a matter of some difficulty. The ants running rapidly toward the battlefield were hugely excited. Their antennae waved wildly, and the infrequent wounded one limping back toward the city was instantly and repeatedly challenged by the advancing insects. They crossed their antenna with his, and required thorough evidence that he was of the proper city before allowing him to proceed. Once they arrived at the battlefield, they flung themselves into the fray, becoming lost and indistinguishable in the tide of straining, fighting black bodies. Men in such a battle, without distinguishing marks or battle cries, would have fought among themselves as often as against their foes, but the ants had a much simpler method of identification. Each ant city possesses its individual odor, a variant on the scent of formic acid, and each individual of that city is recognized in his world quite simply and surely by the way he smells. The little tribe of human beings passed precariously behind a group of 100 excited insect warriors, and before the following group of 40 equally excited black insects. Burl hurried on with his following, putting many miles of perilous territory behind before nightfall. Many times during the day they saw the sudden billowing of a red-brown dust cloud from the earth, and more than once they came upon the empty skin and drooping stalk of one of the red mushrooms, and more often still they came upon the mushrooms themselves, grown fat and taut, prepared to send their deadly spores into the air when the pressure from within became more than the leathery skin could stand. That night the tribe hid among the bases of giant puffballs, which at a touch shot out a puff of white powder resembling smoke. The powder was precisely the same in nature as that cast out by the red mushrooms, but its effects were marvelously and mercifully different. It was innocuous. Burl slept soundly this night, having been 2 days and a night without rest. But the remainder of his tribe, and even Saya, were fearful and afraid, listening ceaselessly all through the dark hours for the menacing sound of creatures coming to prey upon them. And so, for a week, the march kept on. Burl would not allow his tribe to stop to forage for food. The red mushrooms were all about. Once one of the little children was caught in a whirling eddy of red dust, and its mother rushed into the deadly stuff to seize it and bring it out. Then the tribe had to hide for 3 days while the 2 of them recovered from the debilitating poison. Once, too, they found a half-acre patch of the giant cabbages. There were 6 of them full grown, and a dozen or more smaller ones. And Burl took 2 men and speared 2 of the huge 12-foot slugs that fed upon the leaves. When the tribe passed on, it was gorged on the fat meat of the slugs, and there was much soft fur, so that all the tribesfolk wore loincloths of the yellow stuff. There were perils, too, in the journey. On the 4th day of the tribe's traveling, Burl froze suddenly into stillness. One of the hairy tarantulas, a trapdoor spider with a black belly, had fallen upon a scabrous beetle and was devouring it only 100 yards ahead. The tribefolk, trembling, went back for half a mile or more in panic-stricken silence, and refused to advance until he had led them a detour of 2 or 3 miles to one side of the dangerous spot. Long, fear-ridden marches through perilous countries unknown to them, through the golden aisles of yellow mushroom forests, over the flaking surfaces of plains covered with many-colored rusts and moles, pauses beside turbid pools whose waters were concealed by thick layers of green slime, and other evil-smelling ponds which foamed and bubbled slowly, which were covered with pasty yeasts that rose in strange forms of discolored foam. Fleeting glimpses they had of the glistening spokes of symmetrical spiders' webs, whose least thread it would have been beyond the power of the strongest of the tribe to break. They passed through a forest of puffballs, which boomed when touched and shot a puff of vapor from their open mouths. Once they saw a long and sinuous insect that fled before them and disappeared into a burrow in the ground, running with incredible speed upon legs of uncountable number. It was a centipede all of 30 feet in length, and when they crossed the path it had followed, a horrible stench came to their nostrils so that they hurried on. Long escape from unguessed dangers brought boldness of a sort to the pink-skinned men, and they would have rested. They went to Burl with their complaint, and he simply pointed with his hands behind them. There were 3 little clouds of brownish vapor in the air, where they could see along the road they had traversed. To the right of them a dust cloud was just settling, and to the left another rose as they looked. A new trick of the deadly dust became apparent now. Toward the end of a day in which they had traveled a long distance, one of the little children ran a little to the left of the route its elders were following. The earth had taken on a brownish hue, and the child stirred up the surface mold with its feet. The brownish dust that had settled there was raised again, and the child ran crying and choking to its mother, its lungs burning as with fire and its eyes like hot coals. Another day would pass before the child could walk. In a strange country, knowing nothing of the dangers that might assail the tribe while waiting for the child to recover, Burl looked about for a hiding place. Far over to the right, a low cliff, perhaps 20 or 30 feet high, showed sides of crumbling yellow clay, and from where Burl stood he could see the dark openings of burrows scattered here and there upon its face. He watched for a time to see if any bee or wasp inhabited them, knowing that many kinds of both insects dig burrows for their young, and do not occupy them themselves. No dark forms appeared, however, and he led his people toward the openings. The appearance of the holes confirmed his surmise. They had been dug months before by mining bees, and the entrances were weathered and worn. The tribefolk made their way into the 3-foot tunnels and hid themselves, seizing the opportunity to gorge themselves upon the food they carried. Burl stationed himself near the outer end of one of the little caves to watch for signs of danger. While waiting, he poked cautiously with his spear at a little pile of white and sticky parchment-like stuff he saw just within the mouth of the tunnel. Instantly movement became visible. 50, 60, or 100 tiny creatures, no more than half an inch in length, tumbled pell-mell from the dirty white heap. Awkward legs, tiny greenish-black bodies, and bristles protruding in every direction made them strange to look upon. They had tumbled from the whitish heap, and now they made haste to hide themselves in it again, moving slowly and clumsily with immense effort and laborious contortions of their bodies. Burl had never seen any insect progress in such a slow and ineffective fashion before. He drew one little insect back with the point of his spear and examined it from a safe distance. Tiny jaws before the head met like twin sickles, and the whole body was shaped like a rounded diamond lozenge. Burl knew that no insect of such small size could be dangerous, and leaned over, then took one creature in his hand. It wriggled frantically and slipped from his fingers, dropping upon the soft yellow caterpillar fur he had about his middle. Instantly, as if it were a conjuring trick, the little insect vanished, and Burl searched for a matter of minutes before he found it hidden deep in the long, soft hairs of the fur, resting motionless and evidently at ease. It was a bee louse, the first larval form of a beetle whose horny armor could be seen in fragments for yards before the clayey cliffside. Hidden in the openings of the bee's tunnel, it waited until the bee grubs farther back in their separate cells should complete their changes of form and emerge into the open air, passing over the cluster of tiny creatures in the doorway. As the bees pass, the little bee lice would clamber in eager haste up their hairy legs and come to rest in the fur above their thoraxes. Then, weeks later, when the bees in turn made other cells and stocked them with honey for the eggs they would lay, the tiny creatures would slip from their resting places and be left behind in the fully provisioned cell, to eat not only the honey the bee had so laboriously acquired, but the very grub hatched from the bee's egg. Burl had no difficulty in detaching the small insect and chasing it away, but in doing so discovered 3 more that had hidden themselves in his furry garment, no doubt thinking it the coat of their natural though unwilling hosts. He plucked them away and discovered more and more. His garment was the hiding place for dozens of the creatures. Disgusted and annoyed, he went out of the cavern to a spot some distance away, where he took off his robe and pounded it with the flat side of his spear to dislodge the visitors. They dropped out one by one, reluctantly, and finally the garment was clean of them. Then Burl heard a shout from the direction of the mining bee caves, and hastened toward the sound. It was then drawing toward the time of darkness, but one of the tribesmen had ventured out and found no less than 3 of the great imperial mushrooms. Of the 3, one had been attacked by a parasitic purple mold, but the gorgeous yellow of the other 2 was undimmed, and the people were soon feasting upon the firm flesh. Burl felt a little pang of jealousy, though he joined in the consumption of the find as readily as the others, and presently drew a little to one side. He cast his eyes across the country, level and unbroken as far as the eye could see. The small clay cliff was the only inequality visible, and its height cut off all vision on one side, but the view toward the horizon was unobstructed on 3 sides, and here and there the black speck of a monster bee could be seen, droning homeward to its hive or burrow, and sometimes the slender form of a wasp passed overhead, its transparent wings invisible from the rapidity of their vibrations. These flew high in the air, but lower down, barely skimming the tops of the many-colored mushrooms and toadstools, fluttering lightly above the swollen fungoids, and touching their dainty proboscises to unspeakable things in default of the fragrant flowers that were normal food for their races. Lower down flew the multitudes of butterflies the age of mushrooms had produced. White and yellow and red and brown, pink and blue and purple and green, every shade and every color, every size and almost every shape, they flitted gaily in the air. There were some so tiny that they would barely have shaded Burl's face, and some beneath whose slender bodies he could have hidden himself. They flew in a riot of colors and tints above a world of foul mushroom growths and turgid, slime-covered ponds. Burl, temporarily out of the limelight because of the discovery of a store of food by another member of the tribe, bethought himself of an idea. Soon night would come on. The cloud bank would turn red in the west, and then darkness would lean downward from the sky. With the coming of that time, these creatures of the day would seek hiding places, and the air would be given over to the furry moths that flew by night. He, Burl, would mark the spot where one of the larger creatures alighted, and would creep up upon it with his spear held fast. His wide blue eyes brightened at the thought, and he sat himself down to watch. After a long time, the soft, down-reaching fingers of the night touched the shaded aisles of the mushroom forests, and a gentle haze arose above the golden glades. One by one, the gorgeous flyers of the daytime dipped down and furled their painted wings. The overhanging clouds became darker, finally black, and the slow, deliberate rainfall that lasted all through the night began. Burl rose and crept away into the darkness, his spear held in readiness. Through the black night, beneath deeper blacknesses which were the dark undersides of huge toadstools, creeping silently, with every sense alert for sign of danger or for hope of giant prey, Burl made his slow advance. A glorious butterfly of purple and yellow markings, whose wings spread out for 3 yards on either side of its delicately formed body, had hidden itself barely 200 yards away. Burl could imagine it now, preening its slender limbs and combing from its long and slender proboscis any trace of the delectable foodstuffs on which it had fed during the day. Burl moved slowly and cautiously forward, all eyes and ears. He heard an indescribable sound in a thicket a little to his left, and shifted his course. The sound was the faint whistling of air through the breathing holes along an insect's abdomen. Then came the delicate rustling of filmy wings being stretched and closed again, and the movement of sharply barbed feet upon the soft earth. Burl moved in breathless silence, holding his spear before him in readiness to plunge it into the gigantic butterfly's soft body. The mushrooms here were grown thickly together, so there was no room for Burl's body to pass between their stalks, and the rounded heads were deformed and misshapen from their crowdings. Burl spent precious moments in trying to force a silent passage, but had to own himself beaten. Then he clambered up upon the spongy mass of mushroom heads, trusting to luck that they would sustain his weight. The blackness was intense, so that even the forms of objects before him were lost in obscurity. He moved forward for some 10 yards, however, walking gingerly over his precarious foothold. Then he felt rather than saw the opening before him. A body moved below him. Burl raised his spear and with a yell plunged down on the back of the moving thing, thrusting his spear with all the force he could command. He landed on a shifting form, but his yell of triumph turned to a scream of terror. This was not the yielding body of a slender butterfly that he had come upon, nor had his spear penetrated the creature's soft flesh. He had fallen upon the shining back of one of those huge meat-eating beetles, and his spear had slid across the horny armor and then stuck fast, having pierced only the leathery tissue between the insect's head and thorax. Burl's terror was pitiable at the realization, but as nothing to the ultimate panic which possessed him when the creature beneath him uttered a grunt of fright and pain and, spreading its stiff wing cases wide, shot upward in a crazy, panic-stricken, rocket-like flight toward the sky.